Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's the Ukraine War News Update. First part thereof for the 26th of June 2024. Just before I get started, I was contacted this week by Premier Christian Radio as an atheist philosopher of religion. I've appeared twice on their Unbelievable show, which is an incredible show where they pit like a biblical scholar or something against an atheist and have a go at it. And I was asked to debate the great Mike Licona, who's a lovely guy, brilliant biblical scholar. He's written plenty on the resurrection. I wrote a book, The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story, and they contacted me to see if I wanted to debate contradictions in the Bible on the resurrection based on his latest book that's coming out. And I had to say no. Like, my primary progressive multiple sclerosis means I can just about focus on one topic, which is the war in Ukraine. I'm fully in that, and in order to debate Mike Licona, I'd have to basically stop this for a month and just reread my book and get back in the whole zone of it. And so for those who follow my philosophical ramblings, not that I do that so much anymore, I'm really sorry. I'm all in on Ukraine, on geopolitics at the moment, at the exclusion of taking up that brilliant offer. So anyway, that's life. That's where I am at the moment. Let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to the video below. So 1,220 personnel lost is another day of high losses around the same kind of area. But then when we look at the other categories, or particularly tanks, we have the same theorizing as I was proposing yesterday, which is Russians aren't losing a lot of tanks. Do they have a lot of tanks? 4 tanks lost is below average, and a couple of days of that. Previously, there's a couple of fairly high days, but not crazy high. And then prior to that, there was a day of no tanks lost. So I have a feeling that the Russians are really struggling for tanks at the moment. And we are seeing some of their tanks being turned into tracked garden sheds, building on top of it. Turrets maybe aren't working, or they're not in full working order. And rather than repair them, they're using them as glorified APCs. And I think that's because APCs and infantry fighting vehicles, or the ability to carry humans from A to B in a war zone to a landing zone, is more important than having a tank that can fire at the enemy. And I just think that maybe they've got a lack of tank crews as well. I don't know, that can do all the duties in a tank. But I get a sense that tanks aren't as useful right now with what's going on the front lines and how the Russians are attacking. They're not so useful, and they probably don't have so many of them. Armored personnel vehicles, on the other hand, they lost 19 of them, and I think that does show you what I'm talking about there, really. 40 artillery systems is obviously high in that category, over twice the daily average. 45 vehicles and fuel tanks and 6 pieces of special equipment, fairly high in the vehicles and fuel tanks category. So that's where we're at. I think we are possibly seeing some interesting and important trends in some of these categories. Andrew Perpetua, with his loss statistics and his very useful breakdown of those stats, shows us again that it's not in the pure numbers game, it's not a ratio that Ukraine would definitely want. I mean, it's better than the Russians are losing more than Ukrainians, but that ratio is about 2 to 1, almost just under 2 to 1. And of course, I keep saying they need at least 3 to 1 to win or prevail in this war. 60 Russian vehicles lost against Ukrainian, or pieces of equipment lost against 34 Ukrainian. Then we look at combat assets, 23 Russian to 14 Ukrainian. So about the same ratio, maybe even a tiny bit better for the Russians than with the overall stats. Out of the 23, 12 of them, so half of them destroyed or abandoned, 11 damaged. And then for the Ukrainians, we have 14 combat assets, 11 abandoned and destroyed, and 3 damaged. So actually, that's a really bad day in combat assets for the Ukrainians in terms of how many have been destroyed. Okay, let's go and look at the type of equipment and see if there's anything we can learn from this. So the Ukrainians have lost another P-18 radar. That's the third one this week. And they've also lost some other radar as well, pieces of radar equipment. We've got a Bogdana. That's their indigenously made self-propelled howitzer that has been damaged. But other than that, no other artillery. 3 T-64 BV tanks and another unknown tank. Then we've got a number of BMPs, BMP 1s, 2s, and 3s. So no Western equipment in the infantry fighting vehicle there category. Although the APCs, 3 out of the 4 are Western M113, FV103 Spartan. So a couple of Spartans there seen for the first time in a long time. The Ukrainians were due to receive a quite large number of UK tracked vehicles. And there's a bit of theorizing as to exactly what vehicles they would receive. The last major tranche of UK equipment, military aid, obviously the Spartans featured there. And then we have trucks and civilian vehicles, a large amount of civilian vehicles there, given the total losses. So that's going to hurt a little bit, that radar particularly, but we have, just most of those vehicles I just talked about have been destroyed. Unknown causes, FPV drones, mainly part of it. But then, interesting, the KH-35 missile strike took out an MTLB, a Ural truck. Oh no, sorry, 2 Urals, and then down here 2 vans. So they've obviously taken out some kind of supply depot, the Russians. Then we go up to the Russian losses. 2 Panzer S1s. I almost showed you the visuals of this yesterday, but I think I'd already previously shown you evidence of them, video evidence from them on separate occasions. But now it's been confirmed, 2 Panzer S1 losses. Those are $14-15 million each. So that is a very high value loss for the Russians there. Recovery vehicle and engineering vehicle. That engineering vehicle, the Zemledeli, is a mining vehicle, which is actually, that's a good haul for the Ukrainians to have taken that out. We'll talk about that in a second. We've got a Grad amongst the artillery pieces. That's a multiple launch rocket system. And then look at those D-30s there. So a lot of MT-12 Reapers, quite a lot of older Russian artillery equipment. Then when we look at the tanks and IFVs, just the usual sort of ones there, the track guard and shed in amongst there, a couple of those and across the categories. But they're the usual sort of IFVs, APCs and tanks. Quite a few trucks and civilian vehicles, as you would expect, and then a whole bunch of golf carts and buggies thrown in for good measure. The Russians losing quite a lot of them on a regular basis, which, as I said yesterday, shows you that they're using more of those than they are of their regular military mechanized equipment, overtly military, such as APCs and infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. Right, moving on to concern ourselves with some, first of all, just get a bit of a sense of what's going on in the north, because we're going to look at some personnel issues going on in the north. This is in the Vovchansk area, that Kharkiv offensive that the Russians have committed to, but it seems to be a bit of a failure. We are hearing more formally that, or I guess in a way that's a source that's more robust, that the Russians are pulling troops from the Donetsk front to support Kharkiv, which just shows it's had the exact opposite effect, which was designed to take Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk front, and they're having to take their own troops from there to support the operational disaster that is the Kharkiv offensive. But anyway, Ukraine claims they still have a large group of Russian soldiers surrounding Vovchansk. I've been wondering about this. Now, take this with a pinch of salt, as Tim White says. Without proof, it's difficult to be certain of the situation. But Kharkiv governor, Ole Sinyabov, says they're blocked at the aggregate plant in the town. So that's still apparently the case, that the Russians are surrounded. We originally heard there's 400, then maybe 200. However many there are, there's going to be a lot less now because it is consistently bombed with aviation there. Now, just to give you a sense of how difficult it is in the Kharkiv area for the Russians, and one would assume for the Ukrainians as well, right? This is not going to be easy for them. It's going to be attritional since the Ukrainians are going on a counter-attack there, and that, as I said yesterday, will cost them attritionally, because when you attack, you need a 3-1 advantage because you are going to take those losses. Belgorod Hospital here, a lot of Russians from the Kharkiv direction. So this gives you a sense of Belgorod um, being, the staging point for the attack in Kharkiv, and the hospital there bursting at the seams with Russian injured. And then you hear this, Euromaidan press reporting as a number of Russian forces' desertions increased. Elements of the Chechen Akhmat Special Forces were transferred to Kharkiv Oblast to serve as blocking units tasked with firing at their own troops to prevent unauthorized retreats. We have heard this from a number of sources now. This is not one of these, psyops things, Ukrainians claiming this. I mean, it seems to be pretty much confirmed. We've heard it from several Russian sources, from captured POWs and whatnot, that now it appears to be the Akhmat doing some of that blocking in the Kharkiv direction, which would indicate that things aren't going well. So what I'm trying to do is give you lots of data points from all these different areas. So the Russians pulling troops from Donetsk themselves, the high levels of casualty in Belgorod, blocking troops being used because desertions are high. Then you look at this. This isn't necessary. I don't know where this is, right? So bear that in mind. But a Russian soldier films his evacuation and the result of his unit's offensive. He says, the whole windbreak is covered with our guys. Here, a poor guy was torn to pieces. There's lots of effed up equipment. He describes, says Anton Gerashchenko, the effective work of Ukrainian artillery and drones. According to him, in 2 days, Ukrainian soldiers leveled a windbreak that is now covered with the bodies of killed occupiers. He also notes significant losses of military equipment, which is, quote, lined up along the windbreak in unusable condition. And here, this part, I mean, I can't show you virtually any of this video. I've just paused it at one point where there aren't dead bodies. This is a forest. There's more dead lying here and here and here. The point of me, this is anecdotal. What's the point here? But it's trying to draw all of these threads together. And when we're also hearing that the Ukrainians have enough artillery ammunition now coming through, and drones are being used Russians are claiming at least a 6-1 advantage. We're hearing today that they are creating themselves, Ukrainians manufacturing themselves, as the latest is 90,000 FPV drones a month, I think it is. Is it 3,000? Yeah, 3,000 a day. They are claiming to. That's just FPV drones. Not talking about IED dropping drones. Not talking about Baba Yagas. Not talking about medium range attack drones. Not talking about reconnaissance drones, and not talking about all the drones they procure from outside Ukraine. So that's 90,000 drones plus all those other drones. So you're piecing this together and think, right, there are areas where the Ukrainians have this advantage and where they are doing well. Now, they are losing territory along the Donetsk front, of course, still. There are numerical advantages that the Russians have. Partly why they might have numerical advantages is that they are creaming off people from around the world. Now, we had heard previously that the Russians had taken in 14 to 15,000 Nepalese or Nepalese from Nepal. I said at the time, I doubt it's that many, but they certainly are taking a bunch. Now here, Kyiv Independent reports that over 3,000 Nepalese joined the Russian army, according to captured POW estimates. So over 3,000 Nepalese may have joined the Russian army. A captured Nepali POW told Ukrainian authorities on a video obtained exclusively by the Kyiv Independent. So that's significant number still. You put all this stuff together and you're thinking Russians are finding it tough. They're losing a lot of equipment. They're losing a lot of troops. How long can they sustain this? And then you hear, the Trump team suggesting a forced negotiation. You think, not now, not now. I get a sense that, yes, while the Russians are still making gains on the Eastern Front, I do believe that this will be this is everything they can throw, I think, at the problem. They wouldn't be drawing people from Donetsk and putting them into Kharkiv if they had deep reserves. And so therefore, what you're going to see on the Eastern Front is the most that Russia can achieve, which is grinding successes over, meters, hundreds of meters of windbreaks and fields, and maybe taking the whole of Krasnohorivka and getting up to certain points here and there before they reach the major defensive fortifications of the Ukrainians. So And then going forward, the Ukrainians can keep plugging away at air defenses, at all of these, regular military targets, depots and barracks with HIMARS and their own Neptune missiles and attack drones, and hit Novorossiysk and hit Sevastopol and take out all of these places on Crimea, and then continue to hit refineries and military installations. We saw the fire that was burning in that place in Moscow. I don't think that might well have been a genuine fire, but what a place that had started. And you get the sense that the screw is tightening on the Russians to some degree. And then here is the third visually confirmed loss of the Russian Zemlyadelaya remote mine laying system. Previous two units were documented last year in March and June. Now, this is a good thing to have destroyed, right? These can lay loads of mines. That's what it looks like when it's not blown up. And they can. There are several mine laying systems. Some of them just throw up just inordinate amounts of mines, almost like a kind of like a rocket system or multiple launch rocket system. The operating principle of the ISDM is similar to the multiple launch rocket system. Externally, the system resembles a Grad or Tornado G MLRS, and like them has 122mm caliber, but for mine laying it uses ammunition with a solid fuel engine filled with various types of mine. Each armoured Kamaz carries 2 blocks of 25 missiles loaded with mines. Their range is from 5 to 15 kilometers. So you just throw out these mines at incredible numbers, and for one of these to have been taken out, I think is super useful, because mines are a right pain in the ass for, that's an understatement, for both sides. Right, Ukrainians hit, going back to the sort of Belgorod region, a school here, and you're thinking, oh, dodgy, but actually no, it's just being used as a staging place for Russian troops. Completely burned down after a drone attack was housing Russia's army. Astra's confirmed that in the village school of Moshchenoye, 25 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, one soldier was killed and one more injured in yesterday's strike. So yeah, they're using obviously places that lend themselves well to barracking, billeting lots of soldiers. Places like a school, for example, and then Ukrainians are checking that out and then hitting it after intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. In Belgorod again, area of a railway station, tracks were damaged due to artillery shelling. That looks good, but actually they can be fixed relatively quickly. That's why you don't see an awful lot of regular railway tracks being targeted. It's probably not. What you want to do is hit railway depots, areas where you've got, if you remember in Ilovaisk, where you had several times the Ukrainians hit Russians here, you had those wagons carrying oil, you hit them and they burned big time, a bit like on a Kerch bridge, and that then does serious damage to the railway infrastructure. You want to hit bridges more than railways, because a bridge can't be fixed within a few days, whereas that kind of railway can be, but it's still useful for stopping railways from being used and stopping logistics in the short term. Now, talking about that place where it was on fire, the NIL Platan in Moscow is now caught fire again. So it's already pretty burnt out. I mean, you're not using that in a hurry, so I don't know it's going to make all that difference. And it's caught fire again. This is a building where it's horrible to watch, but people are having to jump out because they had no option and they jumped to their deaths. But this was a super important institution here. Part of the I think they designed lots of components for military vehicles, airplanes, but also electronic warfare. So there is talk that oxygen tanks caught fire, and that's what did it. But I don't know. I can't talk to the accuracy of the claims surrounding that. It might have been sabotage. I mean, it looks very likely sabotage because of the nature of the place. But the Russians also all claiming that it's not, and that they were oxygen tanks that burned, and who knows? There might well be really sensitive equipment there that's prone to catching fire. Anyway, moving on from that, we're going to go back to Sevastopol and the beach area, just to show you this, because it's been doing a lot of traveling on the socials, this kind of footage and claims about this, and the Russians made a lot out of this. This was the beach area that was hit by missile debris of some variety here. So it's just panicking there because I thought this one had sound, but actually it doesn't have sound. So what you're looking at here is the beach. And in other bits of footage, this is obviously CCTV without sound. In other bits of footage, you hear the foom, 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 and it would be really pretty scary. Now, this is what you want to do is look out to sea. There are, as you can see, lots of things dropping. Don't know whether it's shrapnel, whether these are sub-munitions dropping from either a Russian missile or perhaps a Ukrainian missile that's aiming at a military target in the area, or a Russian air defense missile. And here, looking the other direction, and it's just down here on the right of the pitch, and you can see the luckily for these people, most of it falls in the water. But I think just on a headland here, this is where the military air base is, and there's military equipment just there. So, it's a bona fide military target, and this is a beach right next to a military target. Now, the Russian State Duma deputy, as I've reported yesterday, Dmitry Gusev, has proposed to close the beaches located near strategic and military facilities in Sevastopol and Kuban, which is, really sensible in a war zone. And we had all these claims from the Russians that this is an American attack and it's America that's to blame for this happening. Before we look at the missile that it may have been, let's just listen to Ukraine the latest. I did mention this yesterday, and I'm going to play it to you.
Thanks to Cliff from New Zealand, who wrote in, and his thoughts neatly encapsulates the issues, I think. And Cliff's given me permission to read out his email. He said, you asked for contributions regarding the moral factors in the ATACMS strike on Crimea. What has helped me with these scenarios is looking through a lens of responsibility. Every party with agency has responsibility for the actions they take with that agency. Look at the parties involved. Cliff says, number one, those who planned the strike needed to weigh the risk of harm to Crimean civilians against its military utility and indeed its ability to reduce harm to other parts of Ukraine. Number two, the occupying authorities had responsibility to control risk to the local population by limiting activities near military targets. Number three, the beach-going civilians had responsibility to decide whether the outing was worth the risk. And number four, the occupying forces had responsibility to consider the risk of air defence actions on civilians. Cliff says, in light of the above, and what we know about the strike, it's my judgment that the level of risk assumed by Ukraine was justifiable, and those who were harmed were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thanks, Cliff.
I think that's a really good synopsis, and there's of that scenario, you've got four, components to risk management. Only one of those is Ukrainian, and actually this is a bona fide target. It falls within Article 58, the Geneva Convention, and it is as mentioned, a bona fide target, and therefore I think they have every right to target it, especially when it's up to the other people involved in that, all Russians there, to mitigate their own risks, right? So he then goes on to say the Russians themselves need to have made these rules so that you can't have people near military targets. They didn't do that, and actually that's part of the Article 58. You've got the Russians, holiday makers themselves, having responsibility for not doing something stupid like, I don't know, going on holiday to the edge of a volcano or the edge of a black hole. Yeah, that's a bit stupid. Maybe you shouldn't do that. So they went on holiday right next to a military air base in a war zone. So you've got responsibility. And then the Russians themselves, in their air defenses and air raid sirens, have they actually mitigated risk as much as they could have done? Then the latest coming out, this is from the Bild's German tabloid newspaper, take it with a pinch of salt. Missile debris on Sevastopol beach speaks of Russian air defense work. So rockets rained down on Sevastopol Yevka beach in occupied Crimea on Sunday. 4 people were killed and more than 150 injured. Initially, the Russian side said that AFU attacked Sevastopol with American ATACMS missiles. One of them, right above the beach, was shot down by Russian air defense. The debris fell on people. Later, Moscow abandoned this version and accused Kiev of a deliberate attack on the beach. But as Bild reports, citing experts, this is unlikely. The debris found on the beach looks like missiles from Russia's Tor surface-to-air missile system. It fires 9M330 anti-aircraft guided missiles. So there is that to throw into the mix as well. Now, talking about activity that took place last night, not a lot of news, to be honest. It looks like quite a quiet night for both sides. Tim White does say still no photos, but there is confirmation from authorities in Odessa that a missile fired by the Russians from occupied Crimea did hit the region, but no real details other than it hit an administrative building in the industrial sector, no injuries. Also, a missile attack on Mykolaiv. But here, Ukraine says a rocket was shot down and it was debris that caused a grass fire in an open area outside populated areas. There's also shelling of Ochakiv, which is on the river estuary of the Dnipro and Bug River as it comes out past the Kimburn Peninsula and Kimburn Spit. Opposite there is a Marines training base in Ochakiv. That's been targeted by shelling, and so on and so forth. All 2 aircraft type drones were downed in Smolensk region, according to the Russians. In Russia, there are Shatalovo and Severny air bases located there. Allegedly no damage or injuries, but of course that's what the Russians will always say. At the moment, no evidence, though, to the contrary. The drones will have passed over Belarus or through the Bryansk region. So, yeah, that's been taking place. But not a crazy amount of news coming out with regard to strikes. And then yesterday, Toretsk was targeted, as it seems to be. So Toretsk is this new area of focus for the Russians, where they had, I think, some opportunistic success, and they're trying to build on that through Sumy near New York towards Toretsk. Toretsk is now being targeted more and more. It has been off and on over the war, of course, but it seems to be that the Russians are putting some emphasis on striking Toretsk with missiles, and you can see here the outcome of those strikes. Right, now moving on to other bits and pieces. Russians are forced to admit, so this is what I was saying earlier, that the Kharkiv second offensive is a fiasco. They're forced to remove troops from Donetsk to strengthen their position. So this is the translation of the Russian source. We can already confidently state that the domino effect did not happen. The opening of the Kharkiv direction did not collapse the front in other areas, no matter how much we want it. So in other words, bringing troops from other areas would then lead to those areas collapsing themselves. It's the opposite that happened. The Ukrainian armed forces managed to stabilize the situation, counterattacking Hryobeke, do not stop to preserve the media coverage of our scare quotes successes. We ourselves are transferring units from other places. Soldiers of the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade arrived from the DPR in the Belgorod region. Also, Tsoy is constantly in my head. The game is not worth the candle, but the result of labour. Don't know what the reference is there. Possibly to a song or a poet or something. Anyway, moving on from Kharkiv. Pentagon chief and the new Russian defense minister have talked for the first time. So that's Lloyd Austin, US defense secretary, having a phone call with Russian defense minister Andrei Belousov yesterday. Pat Ryder said in a briefing. This is the first time Austin has spoken to Belousov since the latter was appointed as Russia's defense minister in May, replacing Sergei Shoigu, who, if you remember, has now had an arrest warrant whacked on his head along with Gerasimov. Both of them, the International Criminal Court has seen them as likely war criminals. Now, Artur Ray here has a short thread we're going to go through. Heavy fighting continues in Vovchansk and Chaziv Yar. Meanwhile, Russia continues to suffer from a shortage of manpower, although the meat storm tactics continue. A Russian war correspondent has published a video in which he filmed Russian soldiers, quote, in a basement. A basement in the occupied territories is a place of punishment. Before the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians were held there, tortured to extract false confessions. But now these basements are filled with Russian soldiers who refuse to go back. In the front, before being sent to back to the front, before being sent to penal battalions. At least 16 such special places are known. The published video shows how terrible unsanitary conditions Sorry, I'm having trouble reading today. Almost all of the soldiers have untreated wounds. Sending the wounded to meat storms has been known for a long time. And I showed you yesterday that there were almost, I think, the word crippled battalions or something. A lot of people being held with injuries and being sent back straight to the front line with injuries that would normally incapacitate you. And also people with injuries being held before they're going to be, cobbled together and themselves sent to the front line, but held in pretty terrible conditions. The Russian army has a special special regiment that they call Crippled. This is the 371st Regiment of the Kantemorskaya Division. And most of those who were wounded or were deemed only partially fit are taken there. After 2-3 months in the regiment, they are sent to the assault squads. Those who refuse are sent to the basement, after which they also end up in the assault squads. So a man who had his fingers torn off was told to relearn how to shoot with the other hand and sent to the assault. In this regiment and in the basement, medical care is minimal. People are kept for up to 3 months. They are documented as fit for service, and several people are taken from the division per day to the assault brigade. So people with a shot knee, a shrapnel near the heart, a shot bladder, and other serious wounds were sent to the assault. This material is written to evoke. This material is not written to evoke sympathy for these people. I don't know why. Sometimes when I on a thread, if I go to a picture, it will throw the actual caption up the list, and I have to go and find it again. It's really annoying at the moment. There's something weird with X or Twitter. Anyway, this material is not written to evoke sympathy for these people. These are occupation troops who came to Ukrainian land to kill innocent citizens of this country. This situation simply shows once again that Russia has a huge problem with personnel. And the data that Russia is recruiting 30,000 volunteers monthly is not correct and based on numbers from Russia. One time, I've been wondering about this an awful lot, and I don't know either way, but the claim is they are recruiting 30,000. That would then replace what they're losing. They're losing, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, today was 1,220, so around about 1,000 plus a day. That means they'll be making a net loss. But previously, when averages were sort of 600, 800, they'd be making a bit of a net gain, and that could go into reserve. So at the moment, you'd expect, even at 30,000, they are not able to sustain those losses, and they are net losing, and they won't have meaningful reserves. But who knows? If that's not correct, and it's, say, 20,000 a month, then they're going to be in even greater trouble. Anyway, Arteray says the 30,000 volunteers monthly is not correct and based on numbers from Russia. One-time payments for signing a contract are also growing. In some regions, authorities are already paying 1.3 million rubles since the beginning of the war. Payments from regions for signing a contract with the Ministry of Defense have increased 80 times, and increases occur approximately every 4 days. There are fewer and fewer people willing to go to the front. Those mobilized by Putin's decree have not been rotated for 2 years. The Russian side's data on volunteers to the front is not based on a reality. The goal is to create the appearance of a huge number of willing people to recruit more new ones. There are also mercenaries from other countries. Often people are recruited through lies. And then this is referring to the Nepali men who are recruited in the thousands to fight in a war on Ukraine and who are treated like dogs. That is that headline there, and we've already mentioned them. Now, moving on, during a live stream by Kirill Fedorov, a Russian military blogger, a Russian soldier with a smirk on his face told how he imprisoned a woman from Russian-occupied Berdyansk for speaking Ukrainian to him. And there's a lot of talk has been, a lot of ink has been spilled on this one, because people raging about how the Russians, I mean, they make these claims about Ukraine Nazis and the Russian language being outlawed, and it's all nonsense, right? And then at the same time, you've got a Russian soldier admitting with a smirk on his face that he had detained a woman, imprisoned her just for speaking Ukrainian, and then delighting in the fact, that he had done so. It's pretty outrageous. Okay. We had a prisoner swap yesterday. 90 prisoners were released or swapped, and then here we have this guy here, just obviously pretty ecstatic about being released. And then
Все нормально, мам. Скоро зустрінемося. Скоро зустрінемося. Тримай себе в руках. Не плач, все нормально.
So you've got obviously very excited family members on the phone there. Mum, don't cry, we'll see each other soon. Ukrainian Marine Vladislav, 22, gets to finally call his mum after returning from Russian captivity. He spent over 2 years in Russian captivity. There's another Ukrainian who got really emotional just hearing Ukrainian spoken, because they would have been made to speak Russian, no doubt, in captivity. If you listen to, I'm halfway through Sean Pinner's book. I've just finished Aidan Aslan's book. Both of these two were British fighters who were living in Ukraine, not like mercenaries. They were fighting for Ukraine as paid up members of the Ukrainian armed forces before the war started, and then they were both captured, and they were part of the people who were released for Medvedchuk. And I've interviewed Sean Pinner. Please go and check out his interview. It's an evergreen interview, so you can still check it out now on my live tab. And I'm reading his book, and as I said, finished Aidan Aslan's book written with John Sweeney, and their accounts of what they went through, and what Aidan Aslan having to sing the Russian anthem every day, and so on and so forth, and also their physical torture, mental torture. It's just incredible, but and not in a good way. The Russians seem to be, being sent back to Russia looking fairly healthy. Many of the Ukrainians coming back emaciated, poorly looked after by the Russians, often tortured, and certainly, not given enough nutrition, so on and so forth, and the ability to speak to their family. So for 2 years, that's not been able to happen, whereas the Russians are, by all accounts, able to speak to their family members by phone regularly, because the Ukrainians are fulfilling the international legal requirements for looking after Russian soldiers, POWs. Steve Rosenberg here reports from the BBC, just seen Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who goes on trial today in Yekaterinburg. Emma Tucker, editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, said, this bogus accusation of espionage will inevitably lead to a bogus conviction for an innocent man who would then face up to 20 years in prison for simply doing his job. And so, one must remember, there's still this American journalist who has been arrested on trumped-up charges, and who is looking like he's going to be going down for 20 years just for doing his job. And the latest UK Defence Intelligence report talks about criminals going back, so Wagner fighters and other criminals who have been taken out of prison, placed in assault groups, and then allowed to go back to Russia after they fulfilled their the criteria for fighting and then getting released, are causing problems back in their hometowns in terms of crime. The Russian General Procuracy says at the end he has ceased to publish official crime statistics since the 1st of January 2023, likely partly to cover the possible rise in violent crime committed by ex-prisoners returning from fighting in Ukraine. The independent Russian media outlet Verstka reported in April 2024 that at least 107 Russians had been killed and another 100 seriously injured by veterans returning from the conflict. The recruitment of prisoners into the Russian armed forces and the implications for Russian communities when they are released is a practice and a risk that the Russian government is prepared to take to maintain its war in Ukraine. So, of course, not just a case of recruiting from abroad, as we talked about earlier, but recruiting from prisons, but they seem to have exhausted most of those prisoners, it appears. Finally, the Ukrainian Statistics Service has reported that Ukraine's GDP is up 6.5% in the first quarter. Of course, it's going to be up from a very low point where the GDP, what gross domestic product, what Ukraine produces on an annual basis, would have dipped in 2022 big time. And 2023 is starting to come back, so 6.5% sounds really good, but of course it's where it's coming from. Preliminary estimates suggest that Ukraine's GDP increased by 6.5% in the first quarter compared to the first quarter in 2023. Was it not 4.5% they were hoping it was going to be? So that could be good news. That is better than expected, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.